Hello, Psychology 211. This is your instructor here to talk a little bit about Chapter 13, or class. First and foremost, there's a couple of definitions I want to make sure that you're aware of. I would expect that some of these things you've probably heard of already from some of your other classes. First is the concept of SES, or socioeconomic status. Our book defines that as an economic position and rank in the social hierarchy. You'll see it referred to in many different forms of research in the newspaper related to politics. And our book says that it permeates both social behavior and thought, and that it also represents another level of diversity to consider. I would also argue that in looking at educational research, you'll find that individuals or children from low SES families are less educationally successful generally across the board. So we know that it isn't just a number or just an income, that it does permeate success for children as well. There are a whole lot of labels our book refers to, most of which I'm pretty sure that you've heard of before. Concepts that are labels for class, like rich, and my personal favorite, highfalutin, which I thought was just a Texas term, middle class, white collar, and for those of you that aren't aware, white collar would typically be a desk job, sometimes one that requires more education, a lawyer, accountant, something along those lines, while blue collar would be a manufacturing job or a plumber or something that works with their hands or outside. Working poor, urban poor, another one of my favorites, rednecks. I didn't realize that was actually a social class. And welfare mothers, just to name a few. Our book talks about sort of the shift in the American economy as being an important part of class in America. After the Great Depression, living standards rose significantly for most Americans. But at that point in time, educational opportunities were limited. The very few and wealthy went to college, much different than what it is today where college is for everyone. And certainly more men went to college than women. But then post-World War II, the economy was largely one of heavy goods manufacturing, where there were large corporations and manufacturing jobs that were also heavily unionized. Then the unions were extremely strong. They were part of the political machine, probably even up and through the 70s. And at that point in time, a man generally could have a job in one of these manufacturing companies with just a high school education, be a part of the union, and actually make a good enough wage to support his family, and then also to think about sending kids to college. And they talk about, when they start the chapter, about an individual who has a manufacturing job, and his whole goal in life is to make sure that his children get better opportunities than him. Mainly that is to go to college. So it really is a contrast to what we see today, where the expectation for most of our kids is we really want them to go to college. And college now isn't so much for just the wealthy as it used to be. More recently, the economy has shifted towards an economy of provision of services and processing information. So telemarketing, computer companies, and what we have found, especially for people like me who work at a community college, and that companies need people that are qualified to do what in many cases are new jobs, things like Cisco, networking opportunities. And there is a large portion of the United States and workers that were blue-collar workers in manufacturing jobs that are not qualified for these new jobs. So as some of these large manufacturing plants have shut down over the years, there has been little to replace that for these workers that were largely low-skilled. And so if you'll see on the tab for this week, there's actually an article about the working class and middle class and being sort of dying more often than other classes, in part, some would say, because those manufacturing jobs that have now gone haven't been replaced for some members of our community. So there's a great deal of depression and lack of access to medical care and so forth. And we'll see that there's been a lot of impact in our economy overall and a real shift in jobs that are disappearing for good and being replaced by new jobs that require a different skill set. Today, which you probably know, there appears to be a growing and substantial difference in income and wealth between the richest and poorest Americans. Trying not to sound like a Democrat here, but if we look at the facts, apparently that does seem to be the case. There's a sort of a shrinking of the middle class. Our book also talks about class in using the term stratification. Really, it just is different classes, different levels, and people belong in a certain level or different class. And that's the case sort of in almost any kind of society across the world. Historically, that's been the case as far back as you can go. Our book talks a lot about the U.S. poverty rate, and there are some updated statistics as well that are found on the drive, or on the page, so that you can kind of look at. But they talk about the poverty rate and the shifts in the poverty rate, and that the poverty rate was 14% or higher from 1981 to 1995. And then since 2000, the number of Americans living in poverty has gradually increased. So with the highest or peak of that being in 2008. Most of you are probably familiar with, because I'm sure you've lived through it, the great real estate recession that began in roughly 2007. In years past, banks made loans to families that may or may not have really been capable of paying back their mortgages, and people bought or did buy at the height of the market when their homes were worth, let's say, $400,000. When the real estate market crashed, those homes were not worth what those mortgages or what was owed on those houses, causing people to be upside down in mortgages. And this led to a large portion of default rates and repossessions on homes and a crisis. And you also, if you look at the history, you'll see that the United States government went and prosecuted some of the lenders for predatory lending practices. And so this was a pretty important part of what's happened in our culture in the last few years, particularly as we look at elections and things. Owning a home is, for Americans, it's part of the American dream. Everybody assumes that they'll grow up, go to college, get a job, get married, and have a home. And so it's an important part of the American identity. The other part that our book talks about is something called a closed class system. Meaning that it's very difficult once you are in a class or you're born into a class to really shift out of that. So if you are born in a class of low SES, the tendency is for generation after generation to stay there. And if you look around at the university, you'll find that there are programs at the university aimed at helping those low SES students sort of break that cycle. Programs called TRIO, or at the university level, Student Support Services, where the goal is to take first-generation college students, that is, students whose parents don't have bachelor's degrees, and give them added levels of support so that they can be successful in college. And really that's aimed at trying to break that cycle and decrease the discrepancy in access to things such as education. But we know that there continues to be a great difference, again, in access to education, technology, and things that really do make a difference with your education. One of the things that you'll see for this week, our journal, is a man named Brian Stevenson, who is the head and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And he's a lawyer whose whole purpose in life is to defend mainly death row inmates, as well as children, some as young as 13 and 14, who are on death row across the country. His argument is that, statistically backed up, that the vast majority of people on death row and in prison are disproportionately African American males, and followed by Hispanics, lowest with Caucasians or white people. His argument is that when you grow up in poverty and you don't have access to education or money, that it's difficult to have an effective defense system so that those individuals are more likely to go to prison, and that they have high rates of not only incarceration, but they are sentenced to death incorrectly more often than white people. And he makes that distinction based on class as well as income, and those two, as you know, go together. I think his message is a very powerful one, especially when you consider the fact that there's a large discrepancy between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans as that middle class shrinks. And DNA evidence, fortunately, has begun to clear people in greater numbers, particularly here in Texas, where we actually had the largest number of inmates on death row. That number is beginning to shift as DNA evidence is becoming more used. So as you all work through this week and you do your journal, begin thinking about the identity of America and what might be changing over the last 30 or 40 years as our economy continues to shift. What might happen if those low-skilled jobs continue to not be filled by new skilled laborers or people that are capable of filling those positions? And it becomes increasingly important that educational programs be made available so that those workers can be retrained. Until chapter 14, I'll see you next time.